Chinese American and learning the language and coming to terms with how you learn a language and how you use that language. She also makes some very interesting observations at the end of the essay about why it is the case that language so regularly becomes a part of stereotyping. She talks about taking standardized tests like the ACT and the SAT, and then she talks about how it's the case that regularly it appears as if language kind of defines in some ways who we are and how we kind of think about ourselves. So for example, Asians are often, she said, considered much stronger in math than they are in language, English, because they score much higher on ACT scores, and then they kind of find their way into engineering programs, as opposed to how few Asian Americans grow up to dream of writing, especially in the English language. She finally finishes the essay by making some observations about how she decided when it got time for her to write her fiction, that she would use all of the different Englishes that she had known. The English that she had been raised with, as well as the formal English that she had been trained with as she went through academy and school. At the very end of the essay, her mother compliments her by saying about her writing that it is easy for her mother to read. It's simple. It's so easy to read, simple English. And so this, for Amy Tan, is kind of evidence that maybe there's some success here for her as a writer. All right, let's jump to 2A really quickly. That's a level 1 rating. That's just kind of summary. Let's jump to 2A really quickly and ask what messages or themes come out of a reflective essay like this. Let's list a few. One of the most obvious messages or themes here is, without maybe realizing it, you are your language. You are your language. Now, for native speakers of English, this is sometimes very difficult to appreciate, which is why an essay like this is so compelling. Because if you have only spoken all your life one language, and you never grew up around any other languages being spoken, then for you, the only language and the only life you know is through that language. However, if you've grown up at all around other languages being spoken, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Language is a way people critique you and judge you in some ways. They make you realize that you are somehow special or different, and in that moment, you can begin to question or even doubt yourself. So, in some fundamental ways, you are your language. Number 2, another very interesting observation of this essay is that language is of multiple varieties and types. Think about this. Of course, we can read an essay like this in the English language, no question. When we speak, we of course can speak in the English language. But this essay suggests that there are actually multiple Englishes we speak. For example, there's a huge difference between the language that you're supposed to write in when you write formal essays, for example, in room 303, and the way you text. There's a huge difference, for example, between listening, for example, to a speech by John F. Kennedy and listening to some of the rap music, for example, that you listen to, which is English language in the rap music, and yet it is radically different language. In fact, it is so different that some of you would go so far as to say it's 2 different languages. The language that I'm listening to in rap, which, for example, I might have my grandmother listen to a rap song and she would not even realize that it was English. There would be so few words that she would be able to completely comprehend. Because of why? The inflection, totally sometimes different words, right? And yet you would say, no, this is English, but it's different. So notice there are distinctions that we make between these different types of languages or Englishes. And in the process, we are recognizing that these language Englishes somehow represent different substructures of culture. Right? Finally, a third major message here is the ways in which people stereotype us by our ability to communicate. Well, I almost said communicate well, but of course that's in itself a bias, isn't it, right? The way, for example, that we make distinctions about the way people talk in English. And if, for example, we hear someone speaking in what is called in the essay broken or simple English, what I call survivor English, we often will immediately assume about that person, not very bright. which is, of course, completely insane. Just because someone struggles to use the English language does not mean that someone is not bright, is not intelligent. It's a fascinating study of the ways in which we make assumptions about people when we really don't know everything about that person. One of the biggest arguments for learning another language is to appreciate what it is that we're talking about. Any of you that have studied another language, you know exactly what I'm talking about. How helpless you feel when, for example, you're in a situation and you're supposed to be able to speak in that language, especially speaking to someone who that language is their first language. And they kind of look at you and they kind of smile and you realize immediately, oh man, I am totally embarrassing myself. What, did I just say that wrong? And then they're trying to be nice to you, and in the process of being nice to you, you feel even more stupid. You feel even more insignificant. Imagine for a moment if that person was a teacher and you had to try and get a grade so you could graduate. And that teacher's looking at you and treating you like something's wrong with you. And immediately all of the things that start to line up behind your mind about, man, I'm never going to be this or I'm never going to be that, and I wish that I didn't have to go through this. It's a compelling realization. Of course, if we jump to 2B really quickly, we can obviously point out this is a reflective essay that begins with some specifics and then allows us to go to some kind of generalities and allows us ourselves to kind of make some general observations as well. Notice as well in the essay, she does a really fine job. Like for example, notice over on page 1412, she does a really nice job of telling us how her mother speaks this mother tongue, that she'll call it in the title of the essay. And of course it gives a sense of what it sounds like. She's able to somehow transcribe it well enough in the essay so that we know exactly what she's talking about. Of course, at level 3, and this is where we try to relate in every way to the title of the text that we're working with and the message of the text. Let's go ahead and just ask about some of the relationships to other texts. What for you is the classic example of survivor English, simple English, limited English, however you want to say it, broken English? What for you is the classic example of that from a movie? Can you write down one example of that? Can you maybe, for example, write down what is for you your favorite song on your playlist that you know a lot of people would not immediately recognize as English? Certainly they wouldn't consider it standard or formal English. What is that song for you? That when it's, for example, listened to, you know what's being said because you understand the subculture, the idiomatic use of the language or whatever. But other people, for example, maybe like your great-grandma who was listening to it, would have no clue what's being said or spoken about. Do you have a film, a text, a book, a poem that suggests that you are your language? The way you learn to speak is the way that people will define who and what you are. Of course, at 3B, we can ask all kinds of questions about your dance with language, your experiences with language through the years. Maybe the first time that you ask a teacher, can I go to the bathroom? And she embarrassed you in front of the whole class by saying, I don't know. Can you? Making the distinction, of course, between can and may, which, of course, in your mind was completely silly because the teacher knew exactly you were asking, may I go to the bathroom? You were not asking her about the function capacities of your body. You were asking, can I get up, walk out of the room, and can I go to the bathroom? That's what you were asking. And, of course, the distinction being made to embarrass you, but also maybe to teach you. In our language, we have differences, and we are not asking, can you do something, but rather, may you do something? What are your thoughts about that? Do you have any feelings, strong or otherwise, about whether you think that you should learn formal language versus informal language? Do you see the language in your own life becoming increasingly more formal as you're becoming more academically aware? And in what ways do you think you are your language? If you grew up around people who did not speak English as a first language, do you think you were in some ways limited by that, or rather were you rewarded by that? Because you grew up in a much fuller universe of words spoken not only in one language but in multiple languages. There are examples, for example, of European children who grow up speaking 4 or 5 different languages as they grow up. And for them, this is just natural. This is the air they breathe, the cultural and linguistic air they breathe. How would you be different if you spoke 4 or 5 different languages right now? That would be a fascinating, different you, would you imagine? You probably would see the world much, much differently. Well, Amy Tan's essay, of course, is going to challenge us to think about the ways in which the very simple thing of learning a language is in some ways the way that we became who we are, who we were, who we might be. Thank you.